The jet hummed softly against the endless blue sky, its leather seats gleaming under the afternoon sun. It was supposed to be a luxurious trip across the Atlantic, a family journey to Paris where deals would be signed, champagne would flow, and reputations would be polished. For Amelia Gray, 6 months pregnant and already exhausted, it should have been a rare chance to sit back, rest, and maybe feel like she still belonged somewhere in her husband's glittering world. But peace was the last thing fate had in store. Richard Gray, her husband, had chosen this very flight to parade his mistress. Vanessa Moore, 25, stunning and poisonous, walked onto the jet as though she owned it. With her designer heels clicking against the aisle, she smirked at Amelia, who sat quietly in the corner seat, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. "Richard, darling," Vanessa purred, brushing her fingers against his arm. "You didn't tell me we'd have company." Company, that's what Amelia had been reduced to. Nothing more than an inconvenience. Her heart tightened, but she remained silent. She had survived Richard's cold stares, the late nights, the endless excuses. She thought she could survive this too. But then, in a moment that would shatter the illusion of civility forever, Vanessa leaned down and yanked Amelia's hair. The scream tore through the cabin like thunder. Amelia clutched the armrest, nearly tumbling forward, her baby kicking violently inside her. Shocked gasps erupted from the few passengers and attendants nearby. Phones whipped out, recording the chaos that unfolded in the air. "Stop it," Amelia cried, her voice cracking with both fear and rage. But Vanessa only sneered. "You think carrying his child makes you special?" she hissed. "You're pathetic. You don't belong here." Richard did nothing. Worse than nothing, he looked at his wife with disdain, as if she were the embarrassment. "Amelia, sit down and stop making a scene. You're acting hysterical." Her world tilted. The man she had trusted, the father of her unborn child, had not only abandoned her, he was siding with the woman who had just attacked her. Tears stung Amelia's eyes, but pride kept her from breaking down. She straightened her back, though her knees trembled. Around her, whispers spread like wildfire. Every pair of eyes bore down on her, some with pity, some with judgment, all of them feeding on the scandal unraveling mid-air. For a fleeting moment, Amelia thought she might collapse right there on the jet. Her chest burned, her head spun, and her unborn child's kicks felt like desperate cries for safety. And then, a voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Enough." Every head turned. Standing at the front of the cabin was a tall, imposing figure in a tailored charcoal suit. His presence alone silenced the chaos. Amelia's breath caught. It was Alexander Gray, Richard's older brother, the billionaire no one dared to cross. His piercing gaze shifted from Vanessa's hand still tangled in Amelia's hair to Richard's smug expression. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop. "Release her," Alexander ordered, his voice low but commanding. Vanessa's smirk faltered. Richard opened his mouth to protest, but one look from his brother shut him down. The balance of power shifted in an instant. For the first time in what felt like forever, Amelia wasn't alone. But she had no idea just how far Alexander was willing to go, or how much this single moment in the sky would change the course of all their lives. And then he said the words that froze everyone on that jet. Amelia Gray had always believed in simple dreams. She wasn't the kind of woman who craved designer gowns, red carpets, or endless champagne toasts. What she wanted was far more fragile: a safe home, a loving husband, a family she could nurture with her whole heart. When she married Richard Gray, she thought she had finally found that dream. At first, it even looked like a fairy tale. Richard was handsome, charming, the kind of man who could light up a room with a single smile. He had swept her off her feet, promising her forever in a whirlwind romance that felt too good to be real, and in many ways, it was. Because soon after the wedding, the cracks began to show. Richard, always ambitious, became restless. His sharp eyes no longer softened when they fell on Amelia. Instead, he looked at her as though she was a weight, dragging him away from the glittering empire he was desperate to claim. When Amelia discovered she was pregnant, she had imagined it would draw them closer together. Instead, it drove them further apart. The baby grew inside her, and with every passing month, Amelia grew lonelier. She bore the morning sickness alone. She endured the fatigue, the dizzy spells, the nights when she could barely lift herself from bed. Richard wasn't there to comfort her. He was out late at business meetings that always seemed to end with whispers of another woman's perfume clinging to his suit. Still, Amelia tried. She cooked his favorite meals. She left notes of encouragement on his desk. She smiled, even when her heart was breaking, because she thought love meant endurance. But endurance has its limits. Behind closed doors, Amelia's pain was suffocating. She would press her hands against her swollen belly and whisper apologies to her unborn child, as if it were her fault that their father chose cruelty over kindness. Nights became endless oceans of tears soaking her pillow. She cried in silence, terrified the neighbors might hear, ashamed of being weak. In public, she wore the mask, the elegant wife, the supportive partner. People saw her walk beside Richard at charity dinners and assumed she had it all. They didn't see how tightly she gripped her clutch, forcing herself to stand tall when inside she wanted to collapse. The cruelest part was how invisible she felt. At every gathering, whispers followed her. Not whispers of admiration, but pity. She's not glamorous enough. She's just here because of the baby. He'll leave her soon. Every word cut deeper than a knife. And yet Amelia held on. She told herself she could survive if she just endured a little longer. For the baby, for the hope that Richard would change, for the tiny spark of the dream she still carried inside. But the attack on the jet shattered all of that. It wasn't just the pain of Vanessa's hand in her hair or Richard's cold dismissal. It was the realization that no matter how much she sacrificed, no matter how many tears she swallowed, she would never be enough for him. That was the moment something shifted deep inside her. For the first time, Amelia questioned the mask she had been wearing. For the first time, she wondered if she was done being the woman who endured in silence. She didn't know it yet, but this was the seed of transformation. Still, at that moment, she felt nothing but grief. On that jet, humiliated and betrayed, Amelia wasn't a billionaire's wife, or a society figure, or even Richard's partner. She was just a vulnerable, broken woman, clutching her unborn child, praying for strength. And in the shadows, a pair of eyes was watching her more closely than she realized. Eyes that belonged to someone powerful enough to change her destiny forever. Richard Gray had perfected the art of wearing two faces. In public, he was the picture of charm, tailored suits, a dazzling smile, the kind of man people trusted to lead a boardroom or toast a gala. He spoke of family values, of love, of the future he was building for his wife and unborn child. Guests would leave his side whispering about his charisma, convinced Amelia was the luckiest woman alive. But behind closed doors, Richard was someone else entirely. To Amelia, he was cold, dismissive, and cruel in subtle ways that left scars deeper than any blow. He rolled his eyes when she spoke, cut her off when she tried to share her fears about the pregnancy, and scolded her for spending too much on vitamins or baby clothes while he poured thousands into luxury watches and late-night dinners. At home, Amelia's world was a battlefield of silence. Richard barely touched her anymore. If he did, it was only to push her aside, muttering about how pregnancy made her look tired. His words pierced like daggers, each one chipping away at the fragile hope she still carried. But Richard's betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was calculated. He saw Amelia as a burden, a weak link that threatened to slow his climb. To him, marriage wasn't love, it was strategy. He had chosen Amelia because she was soft-spoken, easy to control, someone who wouldn't overshadow him or challenge his ambitions. She had been perfect, for a time. But once he believed she had served her purpose, he turned his gaze elsewhere. And that elsewhere was Vanessa Moore. Vanessa was everything Amelia wasn't. Bold, flashy, unafraid to claw her way into any room. She flattered Richard's ego, made him feel powerful, and most importantly, she dangled connections he believed could help him outshine his older brother, Alexander. Richard's envy of Alexander ran deep. All his life, he had lived in the shadow of the elder Gray, the billionaire genius, the respected leader, the man who seemed untouchable. Richard burned with the desire to eclipse him, to prove he wasn't just the forgotten second son. And in his twisted mind, Vanessa was the key. "She knows investors I need," he once muttered into his phone late at night, thinking Amelia was asleep. But Amelia had heard. She had lain in bed, staring at the ceiling, her heart breaking, as she realized her husband wasn't just cheating with his mistress, he was using her as a pawn in his war against his own family. The cruel irony was that Amelia had always supported Richard. She had believed in his dreams when no one else did, stood by him when he was still just another name on a company badge. She had sacrificed her own ambitions to be his anchor. Yet to Richard it was never enough. What he craved wasn't love. It was power. And power had blinded him to everything else. He didn't care that Amelia carried his child. He didn't care that his betrayal was breaking her spirit. All that mattered was climbing higher, faster, even if it meant trampling the very woman who once gave him everything. On the jet that day, when he chose Vanessa over his pregnant wife, Richard didn't just reveal his cruelty. He revealed the depth of his corruption. But Richard underestimated something. He thought Amelia was weak. He thought Alexander would remain silent. He thought the world would keep looking at him with admiration. He had no idea the storm was coming. And when it hit, Richard's carefully built empire of lies would crumble in front of everyone. Vanessa Moore had never been satisfied with the life she was born into. Raised in a cramped apartment above a noisy street, she learned early on that beauty could open doors money never could. By 21, she had already perfected the art of seduction. Not just of men, but of opportunity. She wasn't interested in love, she was interested in leverage. And when she set her sights on Richard Gray, she saw more than a married man. She saw a ticket into the world of the elite. From the moment she walked into his office, Vanessa played her role flawlessly. She wore ambition like perfume, intoxicating and impossible to ignore. She laughed at his jokes, flattered his insecurities, and whispered promises of a future brighter than the one he had with Amelia. Richard, weak and hungry for validation, fell right into her trap. To Vanessa, Amelia was nothing but an obstacle. "She's plain," she once scoffed to a friend over champagne. "A tired housewife with nothing to offer. I'm the one who belongs on Richard's arm." It wasn't enough for Vanessa to steal Amelia's husband. She wanted to erase her. She wanted Amelia humiliated, discarded, and forgotten, proof that Vanessa had won. That was why she delighted in tormenting her, in flaunting her presence not just in private, but in public spaces, where Amelia's silence would sting the most. The attack on the jet wasn't a moment of passion. It was calculated cruelty. Vanessa wanted the world to see Amelia as weak, to see Richard choosing her side. Pulling Amelia's hair wasn't about jealousy, it was about dominance. And for a few terrifying seconds, it worked. Amelia's cry of pain, Richard's cold dismissal, the stunned silence of the cabin, all of it fed Vanessa's arrogance. She smirked as if she had already claimed victory. But Vanessa's hunger went beyond Richard himself. She wasn't satisfied with being a mistress. She wanted his last name, his fortune, his influence. In her mind, the pregnancy was nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. "She'll be out of the picture soon," Vanessa whispered one night while curled against Richard's chest. "And when she is, nothing will stop us." Richard, blinded by lust and ambition, believed her. He mistook her ruthless hunger for loyalty, never realizing she was using him just as much as he was using her. Vanessa, however, wasn't as untouchable as she thought. Her reckless arrogance left trails, receipts, whispers, photographs. She flaunted expensive gifts Richard bought with company funds. She boasted at parties about connections she didn't have. She posted subtle hints on social media, thinking no one important was watching. She thought the world admired her rise. In reality, the world was sharpening its knives. Vanessa's cruelty toward Amelia only deepened the disgust others felt. Even those who smiled at her in public whispered behind her back, "She's shameless. She won't last. She'll drag him down with her." But Vanessa didn't care. To her, power was all that mattered. If people hated her, it only meant she was winning. What she didn't realize was that every cruel word, every arrogant gesture, every act of spite was building the case against her. And when the storm finally broke, Vanessa would not just lose Richard. She would lose everything. Her pride, her power, and the very life she had clawed to create. For now, though, Vanessa believed she was unstoppable. She believed Amelia was broken, Richard was hers, and no one dared to challenge her. But there was one man she had underestimated, and he was watching her every move. The cabin of the jet had fallen into an uneasy silence after the shocking outburst. Amelia sat trembling, her hand protectively over her belly, her eyes glassy with tears she refused to let fall. Vanessa leaned back with a victorious smirk, while Richard glared at his wife, as if she had somehow caused the scene by daring to exist. And then came the voice that froze everyone in place. Enough. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the tension like a blade. Heads turned. Standing at the front of the cabin was Alexander Gray. Tall, broad-shouldered, his charcoal suit perfectly pressed, he radiated a kind of authority that didn't need shouting. He didn't need to raise his voice. His presence alone was enough to command attention. Unlike Richard, Alexander didn't have to beg for respect. He was the eldest Gray brother, the one who built empires while others scrambled in his shadow. Billionaire, visionary, ruthless negotiator, people whispered his name in boardrooms across the globe. To see him here on this flight was shocking enough, but to see his steely eyes fixed on the chaos unfolding was something else entirely. His gaze lingered on Vanessa's hand, still tangled in Amelia's hair. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward. "Release her," he ordered. Vanessa hesitated, her arrogance faltering. Richard shifted in his seat, clearing his throat. "Alex, this is a private matter." Alexander cut him off with a single look, sharp enough to silence him mid-sentence. "I wasn't speaking to you." His eyes locked on Vanessa again. "I said release her." For once, Vanessa obeyed. She jerked her hand back and slumped into her seat, but her defiance flickered in her narrowed eyes. Richard, red-faced with humiliation, muttered something under his breath, but no one paid him attention. Alexander turned his attention to Amelia. His expression softened, if only slightly. He reached down, offering her his hand. For a moment, Amelia hesitated. She had always felt Alexander kept his distance from her, as if she were invisible, unworthy of his notice. But right then, with the entire cabin watching, she placed her trembling hand in his. He helped her to her feet, steadying her as though she were made of glass. "You're safe now," he murmured, his voice low, meant only for her. It was the first time in months Amelia felt seen. The flight attendants, unsure of what to do, looked to Alexander for guidance. He gave a curt nod. "Escort Miss Moore to the back cabin. She will not disturb my sister-in-law again." Sister-in-law. The words hit Richard like a blow. He opened his mouth, ready to protest again, but Alexander's glare silenced him. Around them, murmurs rippled through the cabin. Phones continued recording, but now the story was no longer about Amelia's humiliation. It was about Alexander Gray stepping in, making it clear where his loyalty lay. For Amelia, it was overwhelming. The man she thought indifferent was suddenly her shield. The man her husband envied was the one who treated her with dignity. She clutched her belly, a single tear sliding down her cheek, not from shame this time, but from relief. But deep down, she knew this moment was only the beginning. Richard would not forgive this humiliation. Vanessa would not forget being silenced. And Alexander had just drawn a line in the sand. No one on that jet realized it yet, but war had just been declared within the Gray family, and the world would soon watch it unfold. The jet landed in Paris, under a cloud heavier than the sky itself. For most passengers, the journey had ended, but for Amelia Gray, the nightmare was only beginning. Richard stormed off first, refusing even to glance at her. Vanessa, still fuming after Alexander's intervention, followed in his shadow, her heels clacking against the marble floor of the private terminal. Amelia remained seated, her body stiff, her heart heavier than lead. She waited until everyone else was gone before rising slowly, clutching her belly as though the child inside was the only anchor left holding her to this world. That night, in the luxury hotel Richard had once promised would be their Parisian getaway, Amelia sat alone. The chandelier sparkled above her, the sweet silk curtains swayed gently in the breeze, but none of it mattered. Surrounded by opulence, she felt more abandoned than ever. She curled into the corner of the king-sized bed, a blanket draped around her trembling shoulders. Her phone lit up with messages from her mother back home, cheerful texts about baby names and nursery decorations. Amelia stared at the screen, her throat tightening. How could she tell her mother the truth? How could she admit that the life she had built was crumbling, that the man she had loved had chosen another? The tears came in quiet waves, soaking the pillow beneath her. She pressed her hand against her swollen belly. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the child inside. "I'm so sorry you had to feel that. I promise, I'll protect you. I'll protect us both." But her voice cracked, and the promise felt fragile. For the first time, Amelia wondered if she was strong enough. The emotional pain was almost worse than the physical. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Vanessa's sneer, Richard's cold glare, and the silent stares of strangers who had witnessed her humiliation. It replayed in her mind like a cruel movie she couldn't shut off. And then came the guilt. She blamed herself for being too quiet, too trusting, too forgiving. She wondered if maybe Richard was right, that she wasn't enough, that she was just a burden. The cruel whispers of society echoed in her head. She's only there because of the baby. She'll never last. The sobs grew louder, filling the empty room. Yet outside her door, the world carried on. Down the hall, champagne corks popped, laughter rang out, music pulsed. Paris was alive, but Amelia felt like she was slowly dying inside. She thought she was completely alone, but she wasn't. From the adjoining suite, Alexander Gray sat quietly at his desk, reviewing documents. But even through the thick walls, he could hear the muffled cries of his sister-in-law. He closed the file, his jaw tightening. He had seen women cry before, at negotiations, at defeats, at personal losses. But this was different. These were the cries of someone abandoned, someone who had been broken not by strangers but by the very man who vowed to protect her. He rose, hesitating at her door. For years, Alexander had kept himself apart, believing it wasn't his place to interfere in his brother's marriage. But what he had witnessed on that jet, and what he heard now, left no room for neutrality. He knocked gently. "Amelia?" Inside, Amelia froze. She wiped at her tears, forcing herself to sound steady. "I'm fine," she lied. But Alexander's voice carried through the door, calm yet unyielding. "You don't have to be." Her breath caught. For the first time in months, someone had given her permission to stop pretending. And in that fragile moment, the walls around her heart began to crack, and a new chapter in her life was about to begin. Alexander Gray wasn't a man who dwelled on emotions. His life was built on logic, numbers, and strategies that toppled corporations. But that night, after hearing Amelia's quiet sobs through the hotel walls, he found himself remembering things he had ignored for far too long. He had always kept his distance from his brother's wife, convincing himself it wasn't his place to intervene. Richard's marriage, however flawed, was Richard's business, or so he told himself. But now, the pieces he had overlooked began to fall into place, painting a picture he could no longer deny. The first memory was from 2 years earlier, at a family dinner in the Gray estate. Amelia had been radiant in a pale blue dress, trying her best to fit into a room filled with power players and sharp-tongued socialites. Richard had spent most of the evening on his phone, barely acknowledging her. When Amelia had nervously offered an opinion about one of the foundation's charity projects, Richard had cut her down with a laugh. "Leave the business talk to the adults, darling." The table had chuckled politely, and Amelia had flushed, forcing a smile. Alexander remembered the way she had lowered her eyes, hiding the sting behind politeness. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. But now, he realized it had been the first of many moments where Amelia's voice was silenced. Another memory surfaced. 6 months ago, at a gala in New York, Alexander had caught sight of Amelia standing alone on a balcony. Her makeup was flawless, her gown elegant, but her shoulders slumped as if she were carrying a burden no one else could see. When he approached, she quickly straightened, plastering on a smile. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" she had said. He'd nodded, too busy to linger, too blind to notice the sheen of unshed tears in her eyes. And then there were the little things. The way she always spoke softly, as though afraid to be too loud. The way she flinched when Richard raised his voice. The way she clutched her wedding band whenever other women hovered too close to her husband. All the signs had been there, and Alexander had ignored them, until the jet. Until Vanessa's hand twisted cruelly in Amelia's hair. Until Richard chose humiliation over protection. Now Alexander couldn't ignore it anymore. He sat back in his chair, staring out at the Paris skyline glittering against the night. Amelia wasn't just Richard's neglected wife. She was a woman trapped in a cage of betrayal and silence. A woman who had been fighting battles no one else could see. And for reasons Alexander couldn't fully explain, it mattered to him. Maybe it was because he had always despised weakness disguised as strength, and Richard embodied that perfectly. Maybe it was because he respected resilience, and Amelia had shown nothing but quiet resilience for years. Or maybe it was because, deep down, he couldn't bear to watch an innocent suffer for sins she hadn't committed. For the first time, Alexander allowed himself to wonder what role he might play in Amelia's future. Not as a bystander, not as a silent witness, but as someone who could tip the balance. Across the hall, Amelia finally drifted into a restless sleep, unaware that her cries had awakened something in her brother-in-law. And Alexander knew one thing with certainty. The days of Amelia suffering in silence were over. While Amelia lay awake in her hotel room, drowning in guilt and heartbreak, Richard Gray sat in the penthouse lounge across the city, sipping expensive scotch as though nothing had happened. To him, the scandal on the jet was nothing more than an inconvenience, a distraction from the empire he was determined to claim. Richard's entire life had been a study in envy. Growing up, he had lived in the long shadow of his older brother Alexander. At school, Alexander had been the golden boy, the one teachers admired, the one girls whispered about, the one their father trusted to take over the family business. Richard, meanwhile, was the other son. Second place, second thought, second best. That bitter truth had burned inside him for decades. And now, in his 30s, it consumed him entirely. He told himself that Amelia had been part of his strategy. She was soft-spoken, compliant, the perfect wife to keep him looking respectable while he maneuvered for more influence in the Grey Empire. When she announced her pregnancy, he'd smiled for the cameras, playing the role of proud husband, but behind closed doors, he saw the baby only as another bargaining chip. Vanessa, on the other hand, was fire. Reckless, daring, hungry. She fed his ego with whispered promises. With me, you'll finally beat him. With me, you'll rise higher than Alexander ever dreamed. Her boldness flattered him, made him feel like the man he always believed he should be. He never realized that Vanessa was using him just as much as he was using her. But Richard didn't care about the risks. He cared about victory. In his twisted mind, he saw the jet incident not as a humiliation, but as a challenge. He was furious at Alexander for stepping in, for making him look weak in front of everyone. That humiliation burned hotter than anything else. He thinks he can protect her, Richard muttered to Vanessa, pacing the floor of the suite. He thinks he can embarrass me, steal the spotlight, make me look like some pathetic child. He has no idea who he's dealing with. Vanessa, lounging in silk sheets, smirked. Then prove him wrong, show them all. And that was exactly what Richard planned to do. He had already begun siphoning funds from smaller branches of the family's corporation, diverting money into shell companies no one would trace. With those funds, he hoped to secure investors who hated Alexander's dominance. In the glittering world of billion-dollar deals, Richard wasn't just chasing wealth, he was chasing revenge. To him, Amelia was irrelevant now. A wife who cried too much. A woman whose only purpose had been to legitimize his image. If she embarrassed him further, he would cut her off completely. And as for the child she carried, Richard convinced himself he could always have another heir. With Vanessa, with anyone. But what Richard couldn't see was the very thing that would destroy him. For all his ambition, for all his scheming, he was careless. He left trails, documents, wire transfers, receipts that told a story he thought he had buried. And Alexander, who had spent years outmaneuvering the world's sharpest businessmen, would recognize the signs immediately. Richard thought he was the predator circling his prey. But in truth, he was already in the crosshairs of something far bigger than his ego could comprehend. And when the reckoning came, it wouldn't just take his money or his pride. It would take everything. Because the one man Richard had always hated, the brother he wanted to destroy, was now standing between him and the life he thought he deserved. The Paris skyline glittered outside Amelia's hotel window, but she barely noticed it. Her body felt heavy, her chest tight. The tears she had fought all evening finally broke free, streaming down her cheeks as she sat curled at the edge of the bed. The stress of the flight, the humiliation, the cutting words from Richard, all of it had built into a storm inside her. Her hands pressed over her belly, as if she could shield her unborn child from the cruelty of the world. Then came the pain. It started as a sharp cramp that made her gasp. Her breath hitched, her heart raced, and panic flooded her veins. She shifted on the bed, but the pain only deepened. Fear gripped her as she felt a tightening she knew wasn't normal. "No, please not now," she whispered, clutching her stomach. "Please, baby, stay with me." Her cries carried faintly through the walls, and in the suite next door, Alexander Gray heard them. He didn't hesitate. He pushed open her door without waiting for an answer, finding Amelia hunched over, her face pale, sweat beading on her forehead. Her eyes met his, wide with terror. "I think something's wrong," she stammered. Alexander's blood ran cold. He wasn't a man easily rattled, but the sight of Amelia in distress cut through him in a way no hostile takeover or corporate battle ever had. Without a word, he slipped his arm under her and lifted her gently. "We're going to the hospital, now." The drive through Paris was a blur. Amelia clung to his hand in the back seat, her breath shallow, tears streaking her face. "I can't lose this baby," she whispered. "It's all I have left." Alexander tightened his grip. "You won't. I won't let that happen." At the hospital, doctors rushed her into an exam room, their voices clipped and urgent. Alexander stood outside, fists clenched, every second stretching into eternity. He wasn't a man used to waiting helplessly. Yet tonight, all he could do was pace and pray that Amelia and the baby would survive. Finally, a doctor emerged. "She's stable," he said. "The baby's heartbeat is strong, but she needs rest, no more stress. Any further emotional strain could put her pregnancy at serious risk." Relief washed over Alexander, though he kept his expression steady. When he entered Amelia's room, she was lying on the bed, pale but awake. Her eyes were glassy with exhaustion and fear. "They said the baby's okay?" she whispered, almost as if she didn't dare believe it. Alexander nodded. "Strong heartbeat, but you have to take care of yourself." Her lips trembled. "How can I, when I'm living in a war zone? Richard doesn't care. Vanessa, she wants me gone. I can't fight them both." Her voice cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks. Alexander moved closer, his voice low but firm. "You don't have to fight alone anymore." For a moment she stared at him, unsure if she'd heard correctly. Then, slowly, his words sank in. He wasn't just offering comfort, he was offering protection. The weight of months of isolation lifted from her chest. She let out a sob, not of despair this time, but of fragile relief. For the first time since her marriage began to crumble, she felt she wasn't standing on the battlefield by herself. Alexander reached down, brushing a stray tear from her cheek. His touch was steady, grounding. "Rest now. Leave the rest to me." Amelia closed her eyes, the rhythm of her child's heartbeat echoing in her ears. For once, she allowed herself to believe things might change. But neither of them knew that outside the hospital walls, Richard was already plotting his next move. And this time, the stakes would be even higher. The hospital lights still glowed faintly in Amelia's memory when the world outside erupted. She didn't know it yet, but the moment Vanessa had yanked her hair on the jet, and Richard had chosen silence, was no longer private. Someone had captured it all, and by morning, the video was everywhere. It began with a single anonymous upload. The shaky footage, filmed on a phone, showed Amelia clutching her stomach, Vanessa sneering, and Richard glaring at his pregnant wife as if she were the problem. A caption burned beneath the video: "Billionaire's mistress attacks wife on private jet, husband does nothing." Within hours, it spread like wildfire. News outlets replayed the clip on loop. Talk shows dissected every second. Social media boiled with outrage. "She's pregnant. How could he just sit there?" One tweet read, gaining millions of likes. "Vanessa Moore is vile. Who rips out a pregnant woman's hair?" Another post raged. But the harshest criticism wasn't reserved for Vanessa. It was for Richard. His cold eyes, his dismissive posture, his refusal to protect his wife, all of it painted him not as a victim of scandal, but as its villain. By noon, hashtags trended worldwide. "Justice for Amelia," "Cancel Richard Gray," "Vanessa the Vulture." In Paris, Richard stormed into the Gray Corporation office, his face red with fury. "Find out who leaked it," he barked at his assistants. "Shut it down. Pay them off." But it was too late. The video wasn't just viral. It was unstoppable. Screenshots flooded every platform. Journalists dug into Vanessa's past, uncovering affairs, debts, and shady business deals. Suddenly, the glamorous mistress was painted as a social climber with no conscience. Worse still, investors began calling Alexander, not Richard. They wanted reassurance, leadership, stability. Richard's phone, once filled with congratulatory messages, now buzzed with cancellations. Gala invitations were rescinded. Partners pulled out of deals. In less than 24 hours, his carefully crafted image had begun to collapse. Back at the hospital, Amelia scrolled through the headlines in disbelief. She had never asked for pity, never wanted her pain broadcast to the world. Yet seeing strangers defend her, watching millions condemn the cruelty she endured, it was overwhelming. For the first time in years, she wasn't invisible. People saw her. People cared. Tears welled in her eyes, not from sorrow, but from a fragile sense of validation. She had suffered in silence for so long, and now, finally, the truth was undeniable. Alexander entered her room quietly, his phone in hand. He set it on the bedside table, showing her the trending headlines. "The world knows now," he said simply. Amelia pressed her hand to her lips, shaking her head. "I never wanted this, but maybe it's what needed to happen." Meanwhile, Richard sat in his suite, seething. Vanessa paced the room, her hands trembling as she read the brutal comments about her. "They're tearing me apart," she cried. Richard slammed his glass down, shards scattering across the floor. "It's him," he growled, thinking of Alexander. "He's behind this. He wants me humiliated. He wants to take everything from me." But Richard was wrong. Alexander hadn't leaked the video. The truth was simpler, more devastating. Richard had destroyed himself. As night fell over Paris, Amelia sat in silence, her hand resting over her belly, the faint thrum of her baby's heartbeat echoing in her mind. For the first time, she felt the world on her side. And Richard, blind with rage, began plotting the reckless move that would seal his fate forever. The great corporation headquarters in Paris, usually a temple of power and prestige, had never felt so tense. Phones rang off the hook, assistants scurried through marble halls, and the air buzzed with the panic of collapsing deals. At the center of it all sat Richard Gray, his suit wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot from a night without sleep. The viral video had detonated like a bomb. Investors were backing out, board members were whispering, and his mistress was in hiding after being chased through the streets by reporters. Richard's once flawless reputation was bleeding out, and the vultures were circling. For the first time in his life, Richard was afraid. He knew there was only one man who could fix this, the same man he had hated, envied, and tried to outshine for years. His older brother, Alexander Gray. Richard burst into his brother's office without knocking. Alexander sat behind a mahogany desk, calm as ever, reviewing documents as if the world outside wasn't collapsing. His steel-gray eyes flicked upward, cool and unreadable. "Close the door," Alexander said evenly. Richard obeyed, his movements jerky, desperate. "Alex, I need your help," he blurted out, his voice cracking. "You have to make this go away. Call the press. Use your contacts. Spin the story. Do whatever you do. Just fix it." Alexander leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. He studied his brother for a long moment, the silence stretching like a blade between them. Finally, he spoke. "Why should I?" Richard froze. He had expected anger, maybe even a lecture, but not indifference. "Because we're family," Richard snapped. "Because everything I've built is slipping through my fingers. Do you want to see me ruined?" Alexander's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "What you've built?" His voice was sharp, each word precise. "You've built nothing. You've siphoned funds from the company, tarnished the family's name, humiliated your pregnant wife, and turned this corporation into a laughingstock. And now you come crawling, expecting me to clean it up?" Richard's face flushed red. "You think you're so perfect? You've had everything handed to you. I had to fight for scraps while you sat on the throne." Alexander's gaze hardened. "You didn't fight for scraps, Richard. You threw them away. Amelia stood by you. She believed in you when no one else did. And what did you give her in return? Betrayal, abuse, public humiliation." Richard's jaw tightened. "Don't you dare bring her into this. She's weak. She was never good enough for—" "Enough!" Alexander thundered, his voice echoing through the office. The very air seemed to tremble with his fury. "You will not speak of her that way. Not again. Not in my presence." For the first time, Richard faltered. His bravado crumbled, leaving behind nothing but desperation. He sank into the chair across from Alexander, his hands shaking. "Please, Alex, if you don't help me, I'll lose everything. The board, the investors, they'll destroy me." Alexander stood, towering over him, his expression cold as stone. "You destroyed yourself the moment you chose power over integrity. The moment you chose Vanessa over your wife. The moment you forgot what it meant to be a man. Richard looked up, his eyes wide, searching for mercy, but there was none. "I won't save you, Richard," Alexander said finally. "Not this time. Not ever." The words struck harder than any blow. Richard stumbled out of the office, pale and trembling, his empire crumbling around him. And as the door closed behind him, Alexander knew this was only the beginning. The reckoning Richard had feared was coming faster than he could imagine. The morning sun filtered through the hospital blinds, painting the room in soft gold. Amelia Gray sat propped against the pillows, her hair falling loosely around her face. For weeks, she had seen only a stranger in the mirror, a broken woman, pale and exhausted. But that morning, something inside her shifted. The video had gone viral. The world had seen her pain, and instead of mockery, she had received an outpouring of support. Messages flooded her social media. Strangers sending love, women sharing their own stories of betrayal, people demanding justice. For the first time in a long time, Amelia didn't feel invisible. She felt seen. Alexander entered quietly, carrying a folder. He had spent the night handling damage control, making sure the company remained stable despite Richard's implosion. But when he saw Amelia sitting straighter, her hand resting firmly on her belly, his expression softened. "You're trending," he said simply, setting the folder down. Amelia gave a small laugh, the sound brittle but real. "I never wanted to be. But maybe this is my chance to stop hiding." Alexander studied her, then nodded. "Then don't hide. Let them see who you are. Not as Richard's wife, not as his victim, as Amelia." His words struck something deep inside her. She realized she had spent years living in Richard's shadow, molding herself into whatever version of a wife he wanted. But who was she, really? Who had she been before the cold silences, before the humiliation? She remembered the young woman who loved painting, who dreamed of opening a small art gallery, who once believed her voice mattered. That woman wasn't gone. She was buried. And Amelia was ready to dig her out. The first step was simple but symbolic. She asked for scissors. The nurse hesitated, but Alexander handed them over without a word. Amelia took a deep breath and snipped away the strands of hair that Vanessa had pulled so cruelly on the jet. With each cut, she felt a weight lifting. By the time she set the scissors down, her hair framed her face in a bold new shape. It was a small act, but it felt like reclaiming herself. Next came clothes. Gone were the muted dresses Richard insisted she wear, the ones that made her blend into the background. With Alexander's help, Amelia chose a simple but striking outfit for her first public appearance since the scandal. A cream blouse, tailored trousers, and a shawl that highlighted her pregnancy with elegance rather than shame. When she stepped into the lobby of the hospital, cameras flashed instantly. Reporters called her name, microphones thrust forward, questions firing like bullets. Months ago, she would have lowered her head, clutched her stomach, and rushed past. But now, Amelia lifted her chin. "I don't have answers for everything," she said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled. "But I want to say this. No woman deserves to be humiliated for carrying life. No wife deserves betrayal, and no child should grow up in a world where cruelty goes unchecked." The lobby erupted. Her words were replayed across networks within hours. Headlines shifted from billionaire scandal to pregnant wife finds her voice. Back upstairs, Alexander watched the footage replay on his phone. For the first time, he saw Amelia not as the fragile woman he had once pitied, but as someone standing on the edge of transformation. And though Richard raged in silence across the city, Amelia had taken her first step out of his shadow. The world wasn't just watching her anymore. It was rooting for her, and soon she would give them even more reason to believe. Paris sparkled that night. The grand ballroom of the Hotel du Louvre was ablaze with crystal chandeliers, golden accents, and the hum of Europe's most powerful figures gathered under one roof. Waiters glided between marble columns carrying trays of champagne, while journalists lingered near the velvet ropes, waiting for stories that would make headlines. And they got one. Richard Gray arrived first. He strode through the entrance in a tailored tuxedo, Vanessa at his side in a crimson gown that clung to her like a second skin. Cameras flashed, capturing her forced smile and Richard's stiff posture. The whispers began almost immediately. "Isn't that the mistress from the video? Why would he bring her here after everything? He must be insane." But Richard pretended not to hear. He tightened his grip on Vanessa's arm, jaw clenched, determined to project strength. This gala was supposed to be his redemption, a chance to prove he still belonged in this world of power and prestige. He believed that once he dazzled investors with promises and charm, the scandal would fade. But as he entered the ballroom, the air shifted. Conversations hushed, eyes turned cold, and instead of admiration, Richard found himself met with disdain. Across the room, Alexander Gray was already present, speaking with a circle of diplomats and financiers. His towering figure commanded respect, his calm demeanor radiating authority. But it wasn't Alexander who stole the attention that night. It was the woman standing beside him, Amelia. She stepped into the gala not as the fragile wife who had been humiliated on a jet, but as a vision of quiet strength. Her gown was a soft ivory, flowing gracefully over her pregnant belly, with delicate beadwork that shimmered under the chandeliers. Her hair, freshly cut and styled, framed her face with an elegance that made the cameras surge forward in a frenzy. The whispers turned into gasps. "Is that Amelia Gray? She looks incredible. She's glowing, strong." For once, the world wasn't pitying her. They were admiring her. Alexander offered his arm, and Amelia accepted it. Together, they walked into the center of the room, and the entire gala seemed to pause. Even the orchestra faltered for a second before resuming with trembling strings. Richard's face darkened as he spotted them. Vanessa gripped his arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. "What is she doing here?" she hissed. Richard didn't answer. He couldn't. The sight of Amelia, radiant and commanding the attention of the very people he had hoped to impress, made his chest burn with rage. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashing like lightning. Amelia stopped briefly, her chin lifted, her expression calm but unyielding. When asked if she had any comment on the scandal, she simply replied, "I'm here tonight to celebrate progress, not pain. My child deserves to know that strength comes from standing tall, even when others try to break you." The room erupted with applause. Investors who had once avoided her now leaned closer, eager to shake her hand. Diplomats smiled warmly. For the first time, Amelia felt not like an outsider, but like someone who truly belonged. Across the room, Richard clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles turned white. This was supposed to be his night, his redemption. Instead, it was Amelia's. And as Alexander placed a steady hand at the small of her back, guiding her through the sea of admirers, it became clear to everyone in that ballroom that the balance of power had shifted. Richard had walked into the gala to reclaim his throne, only to find it slipping away to the very woman he thought he had destroyed. The gala shimmered with champagne and polished laughter, but beneath the glittering chandeliers the atmosphere was shifting. Guests gravitated toward Amelia and Alexander, leaving Richard stranded at the edge of the ballroom like a man drowning in a sea of cold stares. Vanessa clung to his arm, but even she couldn't shield him from the whispers. Richard forced a smile, raising his glass as though nothing was wrong. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began loudly, desperate to reclaim attention. "I'm honored to stand before you tonight." But before he could finish, Alexander's voice cut through the air, calm yet commanding. "Honored?" Alexander repeated, stepping forward. His words carried across the marble hall, silencing conversations mid-sentence. "That's an interesting choice of word, Richard, because honor is something you've long forgotten." All eyes snapped to the brothers. The orchestra stilled, the chandeliers seemed to burn brighter, and the crowd leaned in as if sensing history in the making. Richard stiffened, his glass trembling in his hand. "Alexander, this isn't the time." "This is exactly the time," Alexander interrupted, his tone sharper than glass. He gestured to the crowd. "These people came here tonight to celebrate progress, integrity, and trust. And yet standing among them is a man who has betrayed every single one of those values." Gasps rippled through the ballroom. Amelia stood quietly beside him, her heart pounding. She hadn't known Alexander would do this, but part of her knew it was inevitable. "What are you talking about?" Richard snapped, his face flushed. "This is slander." Alexander reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. He opened it with deliberate calm, revealing documents, photographs, wire transfers, evidence meticulously gathered. "For months," he said, his voice echoing against marble walls, "Richard has siphoned company funds into shell accounts, using the money not for growth, but to finance his mistress's lifestyle." Vanessa's face blanched. Murmurs spread like wildfire. cameras clicked furiously. Alexander continued, relentless. Luxury apartments in her name, jewelry worth millions, vacations disguised as business trips, all paid for with investor money. This isn't rumor, this is fact. He held up a page, letting the crowd see the incriminating numbers. The board members in attendance exchanged horrified looks. Investors' phones buzzed with confirmation as assistants fact-checked the figures in real time. The evidence was undeniable. Richard's mask cracked. His voice shook as he barked, "You can't prove those are mine. You forged them." Alexander's gaze didn't waver. "Then explain the signature at the bottom of every transfer. Explain the email correspondence recovered from your private server. Or perhaps explain why you begged me yesterday to cover this up." The ballroom erupted. Guests whispered furiously. Investors stormed out. Journalists scribbled notes with feverish intensity. Vanessa staggered back, her grip slipping from Richard's arm. "You said no one would ever know," she hissed under her breath, her eyes wide with panic. Richard's face twisted in rage. "Shut up!" he snarled, shoving her aside. That was the final nail. The cameras caught it. His cruelty laid bare. His mistress discarded the moment she became inconvenient. Alexander's voice boomed once more, cutting through the chaos. "Richard Gray is no longer fit to lead. He has disgraced this family, this company, and himself. Effective immediately, I will be moving to strip him of all authority within Gray Corporation." The applause was thunderous. The crowd, once uncertain, erupted in cheers for Alexander and Amelia. Their strength, their integrity. Richard stood alone, his empire crumbling around him, the weight of his own betrayal pressing down like chains. And as security began to approach, the man who once thought himself untouchable realized his reckoning had only just begun. The gala ballroom was chaos. Investors whispered furiously. Journalists scrambled to capture every detail, and guests clutched their pearls at the scandal unraveling before their eyes. In the middle of it all, Richard Gray stood frozen, his face pale, his glass still trembling in his hand. For years, Richard had crafted the image of control. The charming executive, the visionary leader, the man destined to step out of his brother's shadow. But in that moment, stripped bare by Alexander's evidence, he was nothing more than a cornered man gasping for air. "This is lies," Richard shouted, his voice cracking. "All of it. He's framing me because he's jealous." He pointed a shaking finger at Alexander. "He's always been jealous of me." The absurdity of his words hung in the air, met with murmurs of disbelief. Everyone knew the truth. Alexander was the empire, and Richard was the parasite feeding on its scraps. Vanessa tried to slink away, her crimson gown trailing behind her like a trail of guilt, but the cameras followed. Reporters barked questions, flashes exploding in her face. Her smirk was gone, replaced with the wide-eyed panic of a woman realizing the game was over. Then, the final blow came. Two security officers, dressed in black, stepped forward through the crowd. Their presence was quiet but commanding. The room fell into a hush, all eyes on Richard as the officers approached. "You can't be serious," Richard spat, his voice desperate now. "This is a gala. You can't humiliate me like this." But humiliation was already complete. One officer took his arm, the other positioned at his side. Richard tried to jerk free, but his strength was no match for their firm grip. The cameras captured every second. Richard Gray, once the polished face of success, now being escorted out like a criminal. "Let go of me," he shouted, his voice echoing off the marble walls. "I'm a Gray. You can't do this to me." But they could, and they did. The crowd parted as security dragged him toward the exit. Gasps and whispers followed him like a funeral march. Some guests shook their heads in disgust. Others smirked, savoring the downfall of a man who had built his reputation on arrogance. And through it all, Amelia stood still, her hand resting over her belly. For years, she had dreamed of this moment, not out of cruelty, but out of longing for justice. She had endured the dismissive glares, the cruel words, the betrayal that had hollowed her soul. And now, watching Richard be stripped of his false power, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. Her eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of release. The man who had broken her spirit was finally facing consequences. And as Alexander stood beside her, steady and unyielding, she realized she no longer had to carry the weight of Richard's cruelty alone. As the doors closed behind Richard, the ballroom erupted in applause, not for him, but for Alexander and Amelia. for integrity over corruption, for dignity over arrogance. Vanessa, abandoned and trembling, sank into a chair at the edge of the room. Her downfall was only beginning, and as Amelia wiped a tear from her cheek, Alexander leaned close, his voice low but certain. "It's over. You're free now." But Amelia knew it wasn't quite over. Not yet. Richard's removal was only the first chapter of justice. The world had seen his humiliation. Now it was time for the law to see his crimes. And when that day came, Richard wouldn't just lose his empire, he would lose everything. The gala's echoes of applause still rang in Vanessa Moore's ears as she slipped out a side exit, her heels clattering against the cobblestone street. Her heart pounded, her breaths shallow. The cameras had followed her all night, flashing in her face, screaming questions she had no answers for. "Vanessa, did you attack Amelia on the jet? Did Richard use company funds to support you? Do you have anything to say to the public?" Every headline had branded her the same way: Mistress, gold digger, homewrecker. The glamorous image she had spent years constructing was now reduced to rubble. No one wanted her beauty, her charm, her sharp laugh anymore. All they saw was the woman who tore at a pregnant wife's hair while her lover sat by. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She only knew she had to run. Her black sports car around, and she dove inside, her hands trembling as she slammed the door. "Go," she barked. "Drive, anywhere but here." The city lights blurred past as the car sped through Paris. Vanessa pressed her forehead against the cool glass, tears smudging her mascara. She had thought Richard would shield her, but he was gone, dragged out of the gala in disgrace, his empire collapsing. And without him, what was she? No connections, no power, no future. She gritted her teeth, anger burning hotter than fear. "This isn't fair," she muttered. "I was supposed to win. She was supposed to disappear." Amelia's face haunted her, not broken anymore, but radiant, strong, admired, loved. The contrast was unbearable. The driver glanced nervously in the mirror. "Miss Moore, maybe we should slow down." "Faster," Vanessa snapped. "I need to get away, I can't." But fate had other plans. The car shot around a corner too sharply. Tires screeched against wet pavement. A horn blared. The world spun in chaos. Headlights, screams, the violent crunch of steel, then silence. When Vanessa opened her eyes, she was pinned, her body broken, the acrid smell of smoke and gasoline filling her lungs. Pain seared through her legs, pain so sharp it stole her breath. She tried to move, but nothing responded. Panic clawed at her chest. The driver stumbled out, shouting for help. Sirens wailed in the distance, drawing closer, closer. Hours later, in the sterile light of a hospital room, Vanessa awoke to the truth. Doctors stood grim-faced at her bedside. "You're lucky to be alive," one said carefully. "But the injuries to your spine? I'm afraid you won't walk again. You'll need a wheelchair for the rest of your life." The words crashed down on her like thunder. Her scream tore through the hospital corridors, raw and furious. The woman who had strutted in heels, who had built her identity on power and seduction, was now trapped in a chair. Reporters swarmed outside the hospital, their cameras waiting. But this time, there would be no triumphant entrance, no dazzling smile. There would only be Vanessa, pale and hollow-eyed, rolled out under the pitying gaze of the very world she once sought to dominate. The irony was cruel, yet fitting. She had spent years tearing others down, reveling in Amelia's suffering. And now, she was the one broken, discarded, her beauty and ambition meaningless in the face of fate's judgment. Vanessa had wanted to erase Amelia from the picture. Instead, it was Vanessa who had been erased, from power, from privilege, from the future she thought she controlled. The storm of scandal had left the Grey Empire shaken. Richard was gone, dragged out of the gala in disgrace. Vanessa lay in a hospital bed, her once proud figure confined to a wheelchair. And for the first time in years, Amelia Grey woke up without the weight of someone else's shadow pressing her down. She sat by the window of her Paris suite, morning light spilling across her ivory gown from the night before. In the reflection of the glass, she no longer saw the woman who cried in silence. She saw a survivor, a mother-to-be, and for the first time, she saw someone worthy of respect. When Alexander entered, carrying a stack of legal documents, Amelia didn't flinch. She didn't shrink back into herself. She turned, lifted her chin, and met his gaze with steady eyes. "The board voted," Alexander said simply. "Richard has been stripped of all authority. His shares are frozen pending investigation." Amelia's heart skipped. For years, the Grey Corporation had been Richard's obsession, the stage where he sought validation and control. To hear it was no longer his, it felt like watching a prison door swing open. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Alexander placed the documents on the table. "Now, the board needs stability. They need a symbol of integrity, someone to balance the damage Richard has caused, and they've decided that person is you." Amelia blinked, stunned. "Me? I'm not a businesswoman. You're more than you think," Alexander interrupted. His voice was calm but firm. "You've already shown the world strength when they expected silence. You've spoken with dignity when you had every reason to lash out. That's leadership. And now, you'll own it, literally." He slid the papers toward her. Amelia's name was there, printed in bold. A transfer of shares, enough to make her one of the largest stakeholders in the company. Her hands trembled as she picked up the pen. For years, Richard had treated her like an accessory, a background figure. Now, she was about to sign herself into power he could never have imagined. The moment the pen touched paper, something shifted inside her. It wasn't just ink on a page, it was a declaration. She was no longer Richard's victim. She was Amelia Grey, a woman who had endured the fire and emerged stronger. When news of the transfer broke, the world reacted swiftly. Headlines read, "Amelia Grey takes her place as shareholder." Interviews poured in, invitations to speak at women's foundations, charities, and leadership events. People no longer whispered about her behind her back. They applauded her, admired her, rooted for her. And when Amelia walked into the next board meeting, she did so with her head high. The room fell silent, not out of pity, but out of respect. Men twice her age rose to shake her hand. Women smiled with quiet pride. She had taken her place at the table, and she belonged there. For Amelia, it wasn't about money. It was about dignity. It was about proving, to herself and to the world, that no betrayal could define her, no cruelty could erase her worth. And as she left the meeting, reporters clamoring for quotes, she placed a hand over her belly and whispered, "We did it." Because Amelia Grey was no longer the woman left behind. She was the woman who had risen, and the world would never forget it. The months that followed Amelia's rise moved swiftly. She attended board meetings, gave interviews, and built a reputation not just as a shareholder, but as a woman of resilience. Strangers stopped her on the street to thank her. Women told her she had given them courage, and for the first time, Amelia felt she was shaping her own destiny. But even destiny comes with trials. On a cold Paris night, as winter settled over the city, Amelia woke in her suite with a sharp pain tearing through her stomach. At first, she thought it was another restless cramp, the kind she had endured before. But this time, it didn't stop. It deepened, relentless, sending waves of panic through her body. She cried out, clutching her belly. "No, not now. Please, not now." Alexander, working late in the adjoining room, burst in. The sight froze him. Amelia hunched on the floor, her face pale, her breath ragged. Blood stained the edge of her nightgown. His calm cracked for the first time. "Get the car," he barked to his security team. He scooped Amelia into his arms, his jaw tight, his heart pounding faster than he would ever admit. The ride to the hospital was a blur of sirens and flashing lights. Amelia gripped Alexander's hand, her eyes wide with terror. "Promise me," she gasped, tears streaking her cheeks. "Promise me the baby will live, even if I don't." His throat tightened. "Don't say that. You'll both make it. I won't let it be any other way." At the hospital, doctors rushed her into the delivery room. The monitors beeped frantically, voices overlapped, and Alexander was left standing outside, helpless again. He pressed his fists against the wall, his breath ragged. He could command empires, bend corporations to his will, but right now he could do nothing but wait. Inside, Amelia fought. Every contraction was fire, every breath a battle. The room spun with white light and sharp commands. She thought of Richard, of the pain he had inflicted, of the humiliation that had nearly destroyed her. And then she thought of her child, the life she had carried, the only innocent part of her shattered past. "I won't give up," she whispered hoarsely. "Not now, not ever." Her body screamed with exhaustion, but her spirit roared louder. With one final push, one final cry that echoed like thunder, the sound she had prayed for at last filled the room. The tiny, fragile cry of new life. The doctor lifted the newborn, wrapped him in soft blankets, and placed him gently into Amelia's trembling arms. Her tears spilled freely, soaking the baby's forehead as she whispered, "You're safe now. We're safe." Outside, Alexander sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands when he heard the baby's cry. Relief washed over him, heavier than any victory he had ever tasted. When the nurse beckoned him in, he walked to Amelia's side, his eyes uncharacteristically wet. She looked up at him, exhausted but radiant, the baby nestled against her chest. "We made it," she whispered. Alexander placed a hand on the baby's tiny head, his voice thick. "Yes, you did. Both of you." In that moment, Amelia's long journey of suffering reached its catharsis. She had endured betrayal, humiliation, and despair, but she had also found her strength. And now, holding her child, she knew every battle had led to this. The ordeal had not broken her, it had transformed her, and her new life was only just beginning. The days after the birth were quiet, almost sacred. Paris, with its glittering lights and ceaseless energy, seemed far away inside the walls of the hospital. Amelia sat in her room, cradling her newborn son against her chest. His tiny breaths, soft and steady, were a rhythm that soothed every wound her heart had carried. For years, she had lived in silence, enduring humiliation and betrayal. But now, with this fragile life in her arms, the silence felt different. It wasn't emptiness, it was peace. She kissed the baby's forehead, whispering softly, "You'll never know the pain I went through. You'll only know love." Alexander often stood by the doorway, watching quietly. He wasn't a man who intruded easily, but every time he saw Amelia holding her child, something inside him shifted. He had witnessed her at her lowest, broken and humiliated, and he had witnessed her rise again. Now, seeing her cradle new life, he understood the full weight of her strength. "You should rest," he said one evening, stepping closer. Amelia smiled faintly, her eyes tired but serene. "I can't stop staring at him. Every time I close my eyes, I'm afraid this is a dream, and I'll wake up back in that nightmare." Alexander pulled a chair beside her bed. "It's not a dream. The nightmare's over. You fought your way through it, and won." Her eyes softened. "I didn't win alone. You were there. When no one else was, you stood by me." For a moment, Alexander looked away, the weight of her words heavier than any corporate deal. "I should have done more. I should have seen it sooner." Amelia shook her head gently. "You did enough. You saved me when I couldn't save myself." The baby stirred in her arms, a tiny whimper escaping his lips. Amelia rocked him gently, her touch tender. "I thought I'd never feel whole again," she whispered. "But now, I feel like I've been given a second chance." And in many ways she had. The public saw her transformation too. Headlines now celebrated her resilience rather than her pain. From betrayal to triumph, Amelia Gray's journey inspires millions. Messages from women across the world poured in, thanking her for speaking out, for showing that dignity could rise from ashes. She became a symbol, not of scandal, but of strength. But beyond the cameras and headlines, the real healing happened in the quiet moments. The late nights when Alexander brought her tea as she nursed the baby. The mornings when he sat silently beside her, reviewing documents while she hummed lullabies. The walks in the hospital garden, where she breathed fresh air and felt the weight of the past lift little by little. It wasn't grand gestures that healed her. It was consistency, presence, a steady reminder that she was no longer alone. One afternoon, as the baby slept peacefully, Amelia turned to Alexander. Her voice was soft, but it carried a depth he couldn't ignore. "Do you think it's possible, after everything, to trust again?" Alexander met her gaze, his own steady and certain. "Yes, because trust isn't about forgetting the past, it's about building something stronger than it." Her eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't from sorrow. They were from hope. For the first time in years, Amelia allowed herself to imagine a future filled not with fear, but with love. Not with betrayal, but with trust. And though her journey had been carved from pain, she knew the next chapter would be written in healing, and in a love that would never betray her. Spring arrived in Paris with blossoms spilling over balconies and sunlight gilding the Seine. But for Richard Gray, there was no spring, only bars, concrete, and the echo of a gavel sealing his fate. The trial had been brutal. The evidence Alexander revealed at the gala was only the beginning. Forensic accountants traced every fraudulent wire transfer, every stolen dollar funneled into offshore accounts. Witnesses testified. Emails and recordings surfaced, proof of Richard's deceit, and embezzlement. The courtroom was packed on sentencing day. Amelia sat in the gallery, her son cradled in her arms. She didn't come for revenge, she came for closure. Richard entered in a wrinkled prison jumpsuit, his once polished appearance stripped away. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a hollow stare. When the judge read his sentence, 15 years in prison, he flinched, but said nothing. He scanned the courtroom, his eyes landing on Amelia. She met his gaze calmly. There was no anger left, no tears, only finality. For years, she had given him her heart, her loyalty, her silence, and he had thrown it all away. Now all she felt was peace. Vanessa Moore's fate was no kinder. Confined to a wheelchair after the crash, she appeared at the courthouse steps once, her face gaunt, her eyes sunken. She tried to address the press, but the world had no sympathy left for her. The glamorous mistress who once strutted in heels was now pushed aside, forgotten by the very circles she clawed to enter. And Amelia? She rose higher than either of them could have imagined. Back at the Grey Corporation, she took her place on the board not as Richard's shadow but as her own woman. Investors respected her for her strength, for her dignity under fire. Charities sought her out as a speaker. Women called her a symbol of resilience. She had become what Richard never could be, a figure of integrity. But beyond the boardrooms and headlines, her truest victory was at home. Each morning she woke to the soft coos of her baby boy, sunlight spilling into her Paris apartment. She would lift him into her arms, press her lips to his forehead, and whisper promises of love. He was her healing, her second chance. Alexander was often there, steady as ever. He didn't push, didn't demand. He was simply present. At the baby's first doctor's appointment, at Amelia's first return to the gallery she once dreamed of opening, at the quiet dinners where laughter began to replace silence. One evening, as they strolled along the Seine, Amelia stopped, the baby asleep in his stroller. The lights reflected off the water, casting a glow over Alexander's face. "You know," she said softly, "I never thought I'd survive all of it. I thought my story ended on that jet, humiliated and broken." Alexander turned to her, his gaze steady. That wasn't the end. That was the beginning. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were born of gratitude, not sorrow. She reached for his hand, and he didn't hesitate to take it. For Amelia, justice wasn't just Richard in prison, or Vanessa in a wheelchair. Justice was reclaiming her dignity. Justice was holding her child in her arms. Justice was the quiet certainty that she would never again live in silence. Her story had been one of betrayal, but it ended in triumph. And as Paris sparkled around her, Amelia Gray stepped fully into her new life, strong, loved, and free. So that's how the story ends. But tell me, my wonderful friends, you're still here with me, right? If you've stayed until now, it means something in this story touched your heart in a way you didn't expect. Maybe it's because we've all known pain, betrayal, or moments when we felt invisible. Amelia's journey reminds us of something the Stoics taught long ago. We cannot control what others do to us, but we can control how we rise after the fall. As Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." Amelia turned her suffering into strength, and so can we. Every heartbreak, every betrayal, every tear we shed can become the foundation for something stronger, something more beautiful. Healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means reclaiming your power. So if you're watching this and feeling broken, remember, you are not alone, and your story is not over. If Amelia could rise from the ashes, so can you. If this story moved you even a little, please give it a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe, because here, we rise together.